Hello students, Mr. Young here. Welcome to Chapter 25, Lesson 1. Now, today's lesson is called The Rise of Dictators, but it could really be called Worldwide Economic Depression Gives Rise to Maniac Leaders. That's kind of what happens. So basically, the Allies win World War I, and they have a rockin' good time in the 20s. In fact, the 20s were called the Roaring 20s. We had things like a lot of illegal booze, because it was the Prohibition, and people partying and flappers and all that jazz. It was a booming time with fancy cars and lots of people making lots of money and maybe borrowing too much. Perhaps too good of a time, so to speak. And then the world basically stinks in the 30s. Meanwhile, in the old Central Powers, they're fuming the whole time because of economic depression and punishment as a result of losing World War I. Radicals seize control. And in the face of possible conflict, the old allies just kind of hope for the best. It's like a powder keg that will explode into World War II, well, in Lesson 2. Now today we learn about all the major players of World War II and what they were doing between the world wars, essentially. What were they doing in the 20s and 30s? So let's go back in time and take a look. Hold on tight. It's quite a lesson today. There's a lot in there. I thought about breaking it up, and I said, nope, gotta jam it all in. So as you may well imagine, World War I, dubbed the War to End All Wars, was a pretty big event in global history. War is a competition, and it produces winners and losers. Some of the losers didn't even lose in the war. They were just on the, they were on the winning side. They just didn't really get a whole lot out of it other than, a lot of people dying and a lot of debt and destruction. The biggest loser, and our first topic for today, however, is Germany. So post-war Germany was blamed for the war, and they got the harshest treatment with the Treaty of Versailles. They lost land and owed the Allies $33 billion in reparations. That's a hefty chunk of change there. That's a lot of scratch. So they were to pay this debt off in installments. Now in 1922, only 1922, the new democratic government of Germany was already falling behind in their payments. France, still in a salty mood, sent troops into the Ruhr, a wealthy industrial sector of Germany, and basically started claiming the mines and mills and these natural resources for themselves, basically because they weren't getting their installment payment. They said, well, you're not going to pay us, we're taking this stuff. Now it just kind of happened, and the German workers refused to work for the French, and so they went on strike, but it still belonged to France, and so now Germany, who's already behind in their installments, lost this major source of income, and they still need to pay these workers, so they start printing more money, and so now Germany not only lost a very industrial sector and a wealth-creating profit center for the country, but they print too much money, and now there's inflation, and now their money isn't worth very much. So Germany is in a bad place. Now, if somebody owes you money, you generally have a vested interest in them paying you back, and their success is key. If they're not successful, they can't pay you back. Seeing Germany on the struggle bus, the U.S. made a plan to help them get back on their feet. In 1924, the U.S. and Europe created the Dawes Plan, named after the American banker who created it. The plan reduced reparations owed by Germany, made the installments more affordable for Germany, and arranged for $200 million, basically a $200 million loan from American investors. This kind of helped a little bit, but crap would really hit the fan for everyone a short time later in the Great Depression. So the 30s were a time of economic depression, which means a time of reduced economic activity and high levels of unemployment. Now, people still debate on what caused the Great Depression, but your book offers a simple explanation. The 20s had a strong economy, people were having a great time, but at some point production exceeded demand, and on top of that, farm prices were dropping. So investors had borrowed money to buy stock, and now they were being pressured to pay back those loans, but they weren't making any money on their investments because companies were cutting workers because they were producing more than it was being purchased, which sounds like a lot. It created a market bubble, and the bubble burst on October 29th. 1929, when the stock market crashed. Black Friday. banks closed, a whole bunch of people lost their jobs, a whole bunch of people lost all their life savings. It was bad. And that depression spread to Europe, and by 1932 you had unemployment between 25 and 40% in the USA, Britain, Germany, and France, basically all the industrialized nations. Now, the different countries handled the depression in different ways. For example, in France, the depression came later and it wasn't all that bad for them. They just cut government spending. In Britain, the government doled out benefit payments and government housing. And in the USA, we got Roosevelt's New Deal. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we'll just call him FDR, that's what everyone calls him, FDR. FDR thought the government should boost the economy and help the jobless. So with Congress, he passed what was called the New Deal. It was a bundle of new programs to help the ailing country. You had the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which basically made jobs by having young adults build parks. So we're going to make a bunch of new government parks. We're going to hire all these unemployed people to do it for us. So that's good. That's good. You had another organization created called the Works Progress Administration, which gave jobs to Americans to build infrastructure. When you say infrastructure, think things like roads and bridges and dams and things like that. Then there were some other programs for farmers and artists as well to provide them work. A massive program created that is always in the news today, especially around election time, was Social Security. The Social Security Act was passed in 1835. It created basically Social Security is kind of like a retirement fund, like a pension for retired workers, and along with this came unemployment benefits. And I mean, those are programs that survive to this day. Unemployment is still a thing, as well as Social Security. And everyone keeps talking about how we're going to run out of Social Security. There's not going to be any left. All right, that's the USA. Let's talk about what's going on over in Europe with the rise of dictators. So over in Europe, new democracies struggled with depression. USA, we were pretty used to democracy. Places like France and Britain, they were used to democracy. There were going to be ups and downs. So when things got rough, they didn't go, "This is the fall of democracy. We've been using it for a while, and we know this happens." But places like Germany and Italy, where democracy was this new form of government kind of forced on them, they said, "You know what's not working for us? Democracy. Democracy sucks." And so they blamed democracy. They didn't have faith in the system. And when the economy went sour, they turned to other forms of government, like the totalitarian state, which is when a dictator and the government want control of what the people do and think. So totalitarian means total control. And in a totalitarian state, dissenters, people that don't agree with it, generally are harshly punished. See, right here, warning, fascism. Free thinking is strictly prohibited. Fascism is a word closely associated with totalitarian states. Basically, when there's no opposition allowed, is the pretty technical term for fascism. So over in Italy, they were having hard times. Benito Mussolini formed the Fascist Party, promising to restore Italy to greatness once more. Remember, like Italy from world history, Italian Peninsula, that's where the Roman Empire had been. So they had a lot of pride in how awesome they used to be. So he had promised to restore the glory of Rome. Now his followers attacked people who disagreed with him in the streets. Political opposition, they beat them up, literally, in the streets. In 1922, Mussolini and his followers marched on Rome itself, where the king of Italy, in order to avoid bloodshed, appointed Mussolini as head of government. Not a great idea, because Mussolini soon banned democracy and outlawed any other political parties. And at this point, he's pretty much the dictator of Italy, and he begins to build up the military to restore that Roman greatness. Now, over in Germany in the 30s, Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi movement, held a similar message as Mussolini. And people were bitter about the Treaty of Versailles and like France taking over their industrial district and the impacts of the recession and, the Treaty of Versailles on their country. Hitler appealed to them by promising German greatness. Hitler's ideology was put in his book. It was called Mein Kampf, which means Mein Struggle in German. And Hitler thought that German people were better than everyone else, that they were the master race, or as they say in German, the Übermensch. Now, there's his book with his ugly little face. Now, by 1932 rather, the Nazi Party had gained a large number of seats in the German parliament. In 1935, Hitler became the Prime Minister of Germany, which at the time was Chancellor of Germany, equivalent to Prime Minister, comparable to a president. Anyhow, he had a mostly Nazi-controlled parliament, and they gave him many powers. They voted him more and more powers, but he basically used to build a totalitarian state, which outlawed opposition. So basically, Nazis at this point took over all the media outlets, and dissenters were put in prison camps called concentration camps. Now, Hitler's government hated the Jews. This is called anti-Semitism. In 1935, they passed the Nuremberg Laws, which basically took away citizenship from any Jewish people living in there. And they were no longer allowed to own businesses or even go to public school. Why the hate for the Jews? People have theories, but basically people have been hating on Jews all throughout history, so it's nothing new. Scapegoat. They're a scapegoat. Hitler and the Nazis blamed them for Germany's woes and troubles, and the Jews were forced to wear the Star of David on them so that they were easily identifiable, like as such right here. Now, bumping over to communist Russia. Over in Russia, we recall Lenin and the communists, the Reds, had defeated the Whites in a civil war. Lenin was in control of Russia, forming his own totalitarian state. That was 1922. So also in 1922, Russia joined with some of the neighboring countries that had at one time been part of the Russian Empire to create sort of a new empire called the Soviet Union, which you can see below. So it's mostly Russia, but you also have little tiny countries like Ukraine. There's a big problem today. Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, places like that. I served with some Estonian troops. Those guys are crazy. So this is the new Soviet Union. Now, when Lenin died in 1924, Leon Trotsky, remember him? He was the commander of the Red Army. And there's another guy, Joseph Stalin, who was leader of the Communist Party. They both fought for control of Russia. Basically, there needed to be an heir, and both of them wanted it. Stalin ended up winning because part of his job was appointing communist officials in government, so he filled it all up with people that like him, so he would end up becoming the leader. And it's not in your book, but Trotsky ends up being exiled. Now, by the late 20s, Stalin was dictator of Russia. Russia was an agricultural nation, but Stalin wanted it to be an industrial nation, so he started building many mills, like steel mills and plants and things like that, and mines. He industrialized the country, like their own industrial revolution. The government, however, took control of all farmland. Stalin was all about this thing called collectivization. Basically, he took all the tiny family farms and forced them to form into larger, more efficient industrial-style farms, sort of like big industrial farms today. Many farmers didn't want this because they wanted to keep their own farms, and so they were thrown in the gulag. So they were forced to do this. Resistance didn't last long. Gulags are prisons in Russia, and usually they're over in Siberia, which is like the cold Arctic wasteland of Russia in the far east of Russia. Thrown in the Gulag. By 1939, the Soviet Union was in fact an industrial powerhouse, but at the cost of freedom. The people suffered greatly because communism never works, which is an opinion of Mr. Yun, but he'll fight you for it. But I can't remember if we learned that in communism, the government owns the factors of production. So they decide what is made and what is not made, and who's going to make it, and what resources are going to be attributed to that instead of the market. So the government's just guessing what people need. So if they're like, we're going to produce shoes, the people need shoes, and they produce too many shoes, which is very likely to happen. And then they say, all right, we think we need this much food. And they don't produce enough food, and then people starve to death, which commonly happened in communist Russia. Now, over in Japan, military leaders had basically taken control and were industrializing the nation. We learned about them fighting Russia in the last chapter, gaining some land, stuff like that. Well, the population over there was exploding,